Okay, hi everybody. I'm Rupert Read, the author of this little number, Extinction Rebellion, Insights from the Inside. Hopefully you've all had a chance to look at it, but if you haven't, it's easy to get hold of in this amazing electronic age. You can go to the link that I've just put in the chat and you can get the book on a gift economy basis. And I'd love you to do so. And I hope that if you haven't already done so, this meeting may inspire you to do so. So what we're going to do here this afternoon is I'm going to talk for a little while to introduce things and read a short section from the book, which I think is always a nice thing to do in an event that's kind of around a book, to actually have something direct from the book. I'll then hand over for a response both on the book and on XR more generally to my esteemed XR colleague, Ronan Harrington, who's very kindly agreed to be in conversation with me here this afternoon. After Ronan's made some remarks, I will make a response to those, and he and I will talk for a while, and then we will bring you all in. Feel free while we're talking to make pertinent comments in the chat. And if you wish to get ahead of the game, as it were, by asking questions in the chat, which we can get to in the second half of this event. And when we do get to the wider conversation involving yourselves, then there will be an opportunity, at least in some cases, for you to come on and say your piece in person, as it were, in video. So I look forward to that part of things. It's lovely to see lots of old faces and new faces turning up to this conversation here this afternoon. You may wish to put your settings to speaker view, which will hopefully enable you to see clearly who is speaking at the time. That's at the top right of the screen for many of you, but it depends on what format you're viewing the screen in. While you're not speaking, it may be wise to mute, and that goes also perhaps for my colleagues here, Ronan and my co-host, Josie, to whom I'm very grateful for making this afternoon possible. So the idea of what we're going to do here today is we are going to talk about this book, and we're going to use that as a platform for talking about the future of Extinction Rebellion and the climate movement more generally. And the context for that is the fact, which obviously is implicit in what I've sought to say by way of titling this event. And that was an idea which came from a conversation already between myself and Ronan, is that XR has had some problems and faces some real challenges. One way I sometimes put this now is, can XR itself build back better? The coronavirus pandemic has created enormous challenges for Extinction Rebellion, but there are other problems which have confronted the organization also over the last year, serious problems. And we'd like to touch on some of those and have an honest conversation about them this afternoon. So that's the idea, really. We hope it will be challenging as well as informative and enjoyable, but ultimately you'll be the judges of that. Just to let you know, we are recording this event, assuming that it all goes in a sort of worthwhile fashion and that we aren't too badly Zoom bombed, fingers crossed on that front so far. Then we will be releasing that recording after the event. If you don't wish your image to be recorded or whatever, then do turn off your video. Okay, so over to me, as it were, to give you a little reading from Extinction Rebellion, Insights from the Inside. What this book is a bringing together of a number of my published writings and some of my unpublished writings on and around Extinction Rebellion from the last couple of years. And the excerpt I wanted to read to you this afternoon is from near the end of the book, because that's where I take the story of Extinction Rebellion, as it were, as close to the present day as I can. So it's a few months out of date now, but not too badly. And talk about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on Extinction Rebellion. So if you happen to have a copy of the book, I'm turning now to page 156, and I'm going to read a little bit from there, from the chapter entitled, "Now is the Time, or Else Our Hopes Start to Fade." We need to be realistic. the forces blocking a profound, full post-corona reset are impossibly vast. Financial and political power are gearing up right now for a good old-fashioned growthist rebound. There is already plenty of carbon bailing out going on, a bonfire of environmental regulations in the USA, and strong men around the world for whom ecology is not exactly a top priority, making opportunistic grabs for more power. The digital behemoths are immensely strengthened. Meanwhile, public transport is challenged, as it never has been before, by the virus. This is likely our last best chance, and we must seize it to reset. But I hate to break it to you, but I think that deep down you already know full well, it's not going to be the full salvation we might wish for. The International Energy Agency forecasts an 8% drop in climate-deadly carbon emissions this year. Amazing. This is it, that rarest of opportunities, the collective chance to reset that we so desperately need. But we need to maintain, in fact, to exceed that 8% momentum every year for the next decade, while somehow accommodating or dealing with continuing demands from powerful quarters for the full enduring reopening of the economy. Is that really going to happen? So let's not pretend that the reset will be all that we desperately hope for. XR needs millions of people all around the world who are inspired enough by the upside of human nature that has been so visible in this pandemic, angry enough at their failed governments, and determined enough to seize this last chance, to come together in clarity to reset in a rather different way to what we've been imagining. The only way we can find these millions of recruits is if we signal clearly that they can't rely on XR to save the day for them. Instead, what's needed is that spirit of true mutuality that has been so splendidly visible these last months. Those who have been close to getting on board with us need a final push. That push, paradoxically, is XR being straight with them that we're not going to pull off some magical victory. Straight talk achieves resonance and congruence where Pollyanna-style dreams cannot. There's a space between total defeat, the eco-driven societal collapse that's coming if the reset from Corona is not sufficiently wise, and the victory that most of us harbour desperate hopes of. It's that space that the coronavirus crisis opens up, of potential flourishing and resilience, even as we adapt to a world whose ecology will be continuing on balance to worsen for a long time to come. Talk of phase shift or phase change to some new civilization where everything is going to be different and great is BS. The simplistic heroic story of 12 years or 12 months to save the world is hopium, a dangerous drug, a story we tell ourselves so that we can picture ourselves as heroes or martyrs or messiahs while crowding out the messier truth. Our world isn't going to be saved, but we can still stop it from being committed to destruction. But we're already on the brink of losing our last best chance to prevent a catastrophic collapse event or events which will make the awful coronavirus crisis look small by comparison. We will so collapse unless we can dare to be brave enough to admit that everything is not going to be okay. When citizens, the elites, and our potential activists and allies see XR evincing such honesty, it will create the space for them too to face the emptiness inside. By being in this way brave ourselves, we offer them the courage to admit that they are terrified and in despair too. For they too want to stand up and be counted. But so long as they can outsource to us their imagined salvation, then the existential crisis, that the existential threat facing human civilization should manifest, will not happen. This, therefore, is a prime, vital chance for truth-telling. And that, I hope, is what I've achieved in the book, as I've sought to achieve in everything I've done in the last several years. Once again, though, ultimately, you'll be the judges of that. So I think that's enough of an intro from me to kick this discussion off. Ronan Harrington is someone with a remarkable career across the world of conventional politics and the establishment and government on the one hand, and organizations like Extinction Rebellion on the other hand. Ronan and I were colleagues for quite a long time in XR's political circle. I think it's fair to say there's some good mutual respect between us, and we work together on a number of things. So Ronan, it's a great pleasure to have you here this afternoon. I'd love to know what you think, perhaps of what I just read, more generally of the book, and more generally still, of where XR is at, where XR might go, and how XR can, if it can, overcome the serious problems that have beset it over the last year or so. Over to you, Ronan Harrington.
Yeah, thank you, Rupert, and thank you for everyone for joining today. I see these kind of spaces, even though Rupert and I would be leading the discussion, as a space for collective sense making. I think all of us have access to, I suppose, on the ground knowledge and just intuition about where we are in society. Who's trying to make sense of it. I have only partial information and full of biases. So really, it's a contribution to a kind of a wider process of sense making that is going to happen on this call and will happen beyond it. But either way, it's something that I have been thinking a lot about. I was encouraging Rupert to actually call this event "Is XR Dead?" And that is almost a blasphemous question to ask. Because it almost seems unconstructive or like you're giving up. But I have had feelings that this may be the case for some time. And I feel that a question such as this, whether we put it as bluntly as "Is XR dead?" or are there some major issues that require a reboot, that these questions need to be asked because we need something like Extinction Rebellion. And I'm quite agnostic. I obviously have my own emotional attachments to the movement. But if Extinction Rebellion's time has passed, then allow it to pass gracefully so the next formation can occur. Whatever that might be, it might be a new name, it might be a new story. And so that's the kind of the territory that I'm asking us to look at today. I take I suppose, an ecological view of social change, in that it's about the resources going to, the best intervention possible. And definitely at the time, 2 years ago, it was Extinction Rebellion, and it made sense that everyone rolled in behind it. And the question is, does that still make sense now, or are we in a kind of a reorganization phase? I'm quite open to either one. In terms of my comment on what you read from the end of your book, like, I always find it ironic that the coronavirus has been, a huge blow to the momentum of Extinction Rebellion. It's taken climate emergency off the agenda. It's prevented any momentum-driven organizing by taking out the ability to actually organize in public, meet face-to-face, build relationships, do disruptive actions. And at the same time, if you were to gather all of us last year and say, what would your dream scenario be for Extinction Rebellion to create? It would probably be something like, well, really, we just want the whole world just to pause and take a big breath to stop the machinery of capitalism for just a moment and to come to our senses. And I think that all of those things have miraculously happened. And it's humbling to realize that, heroic individuals and movements, it looks like they make history, but actually they're more the kind of the symbolic response to the conditions, the historical conditions. And actually it's more like things like technological shifts and pandemics that actually really drive and accelerate history and different trends. And so I just kind of want to hold this idea that even though Extinction Rebellion has been absent from the news this year and has quietened down, in a way the pandemic was its own version of a brilliant rebellion. And there's a lot of, I suppose, a human experience that Extinction Rebellion can appeal to. It's one of the
Ronan, you're freezing once or twice. Ronan, you're freezing once or twice. I wonder if it might be wise for you to remove your video.
Okay. Okay.
It's happened a couple of times now. It might be worth removing your video for a while, unless there's somewhere you can strengthen the signal.
I'll have a look at that once I've finished my remarks, and then, but I'll pause the video for now. where was I?
The coronavirus is itself a rebellion.
Yeah, we thought a lot about how do you get people to viscerally feel climate emergency, and we talked about, you know, this idea of a vulnerability narrative, and to take it from a kind of an abstract conversation to something that was real. And again, the coronavirus brought that. It brought a terrifying level of anxiety about the fragility of our health, of our lives, of impending mortality, of the interlinked nature of our systems, in how close we are to things turning upside down, that I think has rocked people and has kind of burrowed its way deep into the psyche. And in that space, we've also found, again, the very thing that we would hope people would find through our movement building, which is the power of resilience when we come together in mutual aid and mutual support, and how crisis really reveals the best in us. So I think that the pandemic has been making everyday rebels of all of us around the world. People have described it as an initiation into active citizenship. And so I'm not too worried that Extinction Rebellion, along with every other political issue, were kind of kicked, apart from Black Lives Matter, were kicked to the side, because we had this important kind of induction moment. So onto this question about XR. So I had a feeling, so just by context, I was one of the main people coordinating the strategy for the October Rebellion. So I was liaising with Action Circle, Political Circle, and Media and Messaging, to basically try and bring coherence to the plans, so that powerful action would line up with a compelling message that would have a kind of a political strategy behind it. In my analysis, I felt like the April Rebellion was this incredible moment of mainstreaming and awareness of climate emergency. And there was a confluence of factors, from the latest David Attenborough production, to it being a subplot on Game of Thrones, to Greta Thunberg, to the 12 Years report. All of these factors came together. And in a way, awareness is quite easy politically. I mean, it was bound to happen that we would come to a sense of, oh no, we're in much greater trouble than we thought. But I felt that the October Rebellion needed to be a shift from awareness to committed action. And that is an entirely different ballgame, to go from awareness to actually the sacrifices that we have to make institutionally and individually now, the discomfort, the confusion that we have to take on in order to avert climate disaster. And I felt that for a variety of reasons, because of how deeply embedded the system is in our psyches at the level of trauma and wounding and addiction to the powerful vested interest, so that was actually too difficult. And that there's a kind of an iron law of history, which is that we don't generally change until the pain of changing is greater than the pain of staying the same. And that actually somehow I just have a continual intuition that we need a burning platform, literally. It just has to be so intolerable. And that unfortunately comes with the kind of climate disasters that are on the horizon. And even if Extinction Rebellion had the best rebellion possible, it recruited lots of people and it shifted public opinion, it would still be very, very difficult. At the time when I was thinking this through, Extinction Rebellion was, I think, in its zenith point. We, in the press office where I was a couple of days a week, we had requests every day from the New York Times, the Washington Post, magazines, like the top newspapers in the world wanting a piece of Extinction Rebellion, huge levels of sign up, money flowing in. And it was a real exhilarating time and place to be. And at the same time, I felt that it was actually in its peak. And that most movements, they tend to last 18 months to 2 years. They kind of arise in a kind of a flurry of excitement and activity, and then either their issue wins, or they shift public opinion, or they kind of calcify, or they give way to internal bureaucracy issues. And I felt like I was living in the peak moment. And actually, even before the October Rebellion, I had this feeling that I don't think Extinction Rebellion or a movement of this time can actually, even with the best organizing in the world, achieve these demands because the conditions aren't ripe yet for people to make the level of sacrifice that's required, unfortunately. And again, I say that with humility, it's just my opinion. And I'm aware that it's a bit of a cynical one, or at least it's not an optimistic, positive one. And that's not to say lots of good work can't be done. And then we had the rebellion. And I feel like the rebellion, I mean, you know, I hasten to say it was a failure, but it definitely did not live up to our expectations. Crucially,
you mean now the October Rebellion, Ronan?
The October Rebellion,
yeah.
in the sense that even though I thought it was valiant that we stayed on the streets for 14 days and executed a significant number of the actions, and I think there was $1 billion in advertising equivalent value of the newspaper coverage that we got. So, you know, on a very basic level, getting the words extinction and rebellion again and again as two frames in the media is a huge contribution. But a lot of the conversation was not about the issue, but it was about us. It was about our identity, or the perceived identity that we have as middle class, you know, kind of champagne socialist luxury people who had the time to protest, hippies, all of those kind of derogatory words. And again, I'm aware that was a coordinated effort by the right-wing press. But there was a subtle sense of XOR being pulled into a divisive class debate that I think did serious damage to the brand. And we ultimately secured that in the Canning Town incident by, in the most perfect visual way, confirming that we're not on the side of the people, that we are above and aloof, and that the movement was a kind of a representation of an aspiration of someone who's probably had a lot of economic and developmental opportunities and has come to realize the climate is in a bad way, rather than being rooted in the struggle of ordinary working people and how climate emergency will just compound those problems. You might just want to hide it if you're going through certain areas because people might attack you. And I found that super interesting, that this symbol that at the time was, you know, the ultimate in cool factor, it was the height of fashion, was becoming repulsive on a brand level. And what I feel, and my intuition, just observing my social circles, looking at the conversation online, is that there's been some kind of, you know, to borrow a term from today, social distancing of XOR. People are not convinced that it's cool anymore. And I know that's a very shallow thing to say, and that real activism should be motivated by the issues, and most of the people, you know, that are on this call that have stayed in XR are examples of that. And yet people's relationship with ideas and issues are primarily, I would say, governed by what it confers on them reputationally. And there's obviously issues of fairness and justice and fighting for the right thing. And also there's association. And I think that there was something happened where it no longer was as valuable to be associated with XOR. And I think that generated a death knell to its momentum-driven organizing. Or again, at the time in October, there was I was looking at the plans of, okay, in April we had this many arrests, we brought this many people in October we're going to, increase it 5 times, and then we're going to use that momentum for the April 2021 or 2020 rebellion and do it 10 times, and we're going to reach this, mythical 3.5% target, and we're going to shift things. And I think that ultimately the movement is dependent on that rapid scaling of numbers. And I think it has lost that momentum. And then you had, things like Roger's comments about the Holocaust. And these just things like really chip away at a movement's brand identity. And I hate to be as fickle or as shallow as talking about a social ecological justice movement in terms of its brand identity, but it's just kind of human psychology and how it works. People developed a bit of an aversion to Extinction Rebellion. Right. So the question I have is, okay, well, is XOR dead? Is it in terminal decline? Could it be reinvented? My sense is that it could be similar to what we saw with Black Lives Matter, where it had its initial kind of public outing with the Ferguson riots a couple of years ago. And then the question of racial justice obviously is ongoing. But then with the killing of George Floyd, it came back in again, not just as a movement, but as a meme that allowed people to continually rally around the inevitable cause of racial injustice. And I think probably something similar would be the case, because climate emergency isn't going away. And if anything, we'll have trigger moment after trigger moment, with wildfires and floods and all kinds of things happening. And all of them are essentially a recruitment tool for some organization or some movement to mobilize people to take action. Now, whether that is Extinction Rebellion or not, I'm agnostic about. I think that maybe the best thing it could do is just tidy up its infrastructure, keep the lights on, and be ready to pounce when that moment happens. I'm a bit skeptical of it doing a rebellion in September. I feel like on multiple levels, I see problems with that. The primary one is obviously the potential for the right-wing press to blame XOR for a second lockdown and for the spread of COVID. And that will be contravening a sacred value, which is that we're all in this together around COVID. So it doesn't matter how legitimate the cause, if that can be pinned on Extinction Rebellion, that will further the identity perception of Extinction Rebellion being this kind of aloof, a class of people that think they're above it, and while other people are working, they're dancing in the streets. And then the second is that I feel like 2020, people are just mentally fatigued and exhausted by 2020 so far. We're just in August now. And I don't think we actually have the mental capacity, even if it's absolutely necessary, to hold another political issue. And so that can also annoy people. Now, again, I'm not saying, therefore, there shouldn't be a rebellion. I can see the counter arguments for it as well. But in this situation, I turn to the question, okay, what would nature do in this situation? If nature was Extinction Rebellion, would it tend to its roots? Would it go back into hibernation? Would it share its resources with a different part of the ecosystem that had more potential? And I think that that's where we should be looking for guidance, because what I see at the moment when I talk to people in Extinction Rebellion is a lot of panic, a lot of fear, a lot of sadness, where, like, we used to be the center of attention and it used to be so much fun, and now it's a bit of a struggle and there's financial issues in the organization. And that's generally not a good place to make decisions. It's coming from a place of scarcity rather than abundance. So I will leave it there as in terms of opening thoughts.
Ronan, thank you so much. That is a really fascinating and powerful analysis, exactly as I would expect of you. Just before I offer some responses, can I ask you to respond to the interesting remark in the chat, which said, from Sai, which said, what's your basis for saying that movements have a 18-month roughly lifespan? I think Sai is skeptical of the claim. Do you want to elaborate on it slightly?
So I basically, this is from conversations with my colleague Richard Bartlett, who studies network dynamics and movement theory. So we've been in kind of conversations about this question, and that's what he brought to me. So I can message Rich, and maybe even now, and ask him for the link to what he's basing that on. But I think, like, if you look at Occupy as a modern example, these these kind of loosely network-based movements, they come together, they're an expression of an intense burst of energy, and they don't really transition into long-term institutions that can hold that power. They generally come together and they disperse again. Black Lives Matters is a good example as well. So I will try and get the link while we're on the call, and if not, we can put it in the notes afterwards.
Great, yeah. And when we get the recording, by the way, we will send it around, seek to send it around to everybody, and we might be able to add in that link then if we don't have it before. Okay, let me try to respond to a few of your fascinating points there, Ronan, and I'll fold in one or two things, other things which have come up in the chat. I'd like to say that I agree with you that that Canning Town was a truly disastrous phenomenon for XR, as so many of us thought at the time. If anything, it's been even more complete a disaster than some of us thought at the time. For the reasons that you gave, it seemed to encapsulate the way in which Extinction Rebellion was being characterized as a movement which didn't care about working class people and was willing to disrupt ordinary people. It made no sense to most people because of the targeting of public transport. It also, of course, involved an outbreak of violence, sort of contradicting the idea of non-violence, which we've been so careful and wonderfully so to cultivate. And I think you're right also to mention Roger Hallam. I discuss Roger a bit in my book, A Strategic Genius in some ways, and certainly a genius who played a key role in the success of the April Rebellion, but who's made a whole series of massive mistakes that have rebounded really badly on XR since, including the whole Heathrow pause thing, the various forays into politics, and as you mentioned, the Holocaust comments. Now, luckily, this has been to some extent dealt with. People may be aware. We've got loads of brilliant people on the call, by the way, and which means it's all the more important that we get to the open discussion part of this. There's been some progress on that recently, in that Roger now no longer has any role in XR, as well as not being a spokesperson for XR. But there has been a lot of damage, and some people are still not happy with the resolution that we've reached, which is a kind of uneasy compromise, and I'm sympathetic with those people. I was asked in the chat, what do I mean by XR's serious problems? So I've already named a couple there, following on to Ronan's remarks, and we've already talked about the problem posed by coronavirus itself. My view is that the upcoming rebellion, which starts in exactly a month's time, of course, I hope that I'll see lots of you there in September in London, that the upcoming rebellion, if it doesn't place coronavirus in the right way, absolutely at its center, will be a terrible failure, not just a kind of a bit of a damp squib, but something much worse than that. We have to make sure that our rebellion is not characterizable as something which is a vector for COVID. That would be totally self-contradictory if that's what happens. We have to also ensure that what comes through very clearly, and I'm worried that this isn't being emphasized enough yet in the rebellion planning, is the way that the coronavirus pandemic is itself a product of the ecological emergency. That it was habitat destruction and maltreatment of animals that made it arise in the first place, and crucially, that planes are the real super spreaders, that globalization and hypermobility has driven this pandemic to travel and escalate far worse than the Spanish flu 100 years ago did. If we're able to land messages like those and to make clear that unless there is a genuine sort of green post-growth, etc., reset from coronavirus, then we're simply fueling the fires of future pandemics as well as of climate devastation. If we don't manage to do that, then the rebellion will, in my opinion, without doubt fail. And that would be quite challenging to do. And I was particularly struck when you mentioned dancing in the streets. I think that we're going to have to be so careful in September, the way that we behave and act and manifest, even more than before, because yeah, that just instantly brought to mind to my mind an image of rebels dancing in the streets in September, and reporters saying things like, you know, so while people are dying in the hospitals in Manchester, this is the response of Extinction Rebels in London. And I'm sure they can do it much more devastatingly than that. It's
Yeah,
going to be very,
I just
very challenging to find a path through that. Over to you, Ronan.
no, just I'd highly recommend a YouTube video called "Burning Man on Thames," which is a compilation of critiques of this very idea. I'll post it in the chat now. But
okay, great. Yeah, good. Another problem that I want to mention is that Extinction Rebellion's original 3 demands, and of course we've now got controversy about a 4th demand, which is quite a divisive controversy, as we've seen from the US. Extinction Rebellion's original 3 demands become less and less credible as time passes. So when we're talking about achieving net zero carbon and net zero biodiversity loss by 2025. So when Extinction Rebellion started in 2018, that was 7 years away. Well, it's now 5 years away. I mean, that's a very significant proportion of the time available. It's just obvious that at some point that demand will have to get modified unless in some incredible way we literally win all over the world incredibly rapidly. You know, when it comes to 2023, is it still going to be credible to say, yeah, we're going to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2025? I put it to you that it's obvious that it's not, or even if it is, then it's not by the time you get to 2024. Choose your date. The 3 demands, as we first characterized them, were absolutely right, and in many ways they're still right, but they're also in many ways more and more of a sort of albatross around our neck, and they make us look as if we're not responding to events. And as I say, we have to be seen fully to respond to the coronavirus crisis, and we have to be seen fully to respond to the worsening climate and ecological emergency more generally. Otherwise, we're not telling the truth. And that's why towards the end of my book, including in the chapter that I read from a bit earlier, I posed the thought of whether we need to be looking in Extinction Rebellion and more generally around the climate movement and so forth for different possibilities of how to go forward. So one possibility that Roger Hallam is exploring is sort of anger and a more sort of extreme form of outright rebellion. And that's what you're seeing with the new Beyond Politics party. I think Ronan and I are both incredibly skeptical of that as a way forward. A very different way forward would be to emphasize the importance not just of mitigation, but of adaptation. And so I've been arguing for some time now that transformative adaptation and deep adaptation should feature in Extinction Rebellion's demands, and that the movement more generally should move in the direction of transformative adaptation, which basically means things like devising actions and devising more generally a way of life which is compatible with the brutal realities of the climate and ecological emergency as they get worse. So slightly more concretely, I envisage a kind of alliance between Extinction Rebellion on the one hand and the transition towns movement and permaculture and so forth on the other. Seeking to energy descend, to create food sovereignty, to build, if you will, the community lifeboats that we are likely to need in the coming very difficult times, and to do that in a way that is politically savvy and that uses the tools of nonviolent direct action and momentum-driven organizing, etc., where appropriate and where one is able to do so. That, to me, is an exciting and possible vision, incredibly different from the vision that Roger has been pushing, and it demands major change of Extinction Rebellion if anything like that vision is going to occur. You know, I don't know whether that's compatible with what people in Extinction Rebellion want, although I do know that a lot of people in Extinction Rebellion and former members of Extinction Rebellion are excited by a vision like that. And I suspect one way or another, that's where I'll be putting most of my energy in the next couple of years. Ronan, any thoughts in response to those thoughts?
Yeah, I do. And if my video cuts out, just tell me immediately.
Yeah.
I can switch my video back on. It seems to be okay at the moment. Okay, so what I see again and again, and I see it in the kind of the underlying assumption in what you're sharing, Rupert, and just generally in the movement at large, is this idea that we're kind of on a juggernaut heading off a cliff. If we don't massively slam the brakes, then you know, it's going to be a complete disaster and maybe an extinction level event. And and then we're kind of running up against, you know, despite saying that, the public government's not really responding to that. They're not really being an appetite for radical change, and it's then just us going into kind of further and further despair. And then creeping in now into the narrative, this idea of deep adaptation, going back to local resiliency, which I think is, you know, I'm pretty supportive of. But actually, I think what's missing is a transformative, optimistic view of how the system is inevitably going to change and for the better. I recently came across a piece of thinking. I'll post a link to it in the chat. It's based on a report called Rethinking Humanity. It's by two tech investors who have gotten many calls right about the future of different sectors over the last 10 years on a very granular level. And
we just lost you again, Ronan. You just froze again.
Technology. It's the printing press that
Ronan, we just lost you again for a second. I think maybe losing the video again might be best. Sorry.
Yeah. So for like the classic example is the printing press, which gave rise to the Enlightenment in Europe. It's the invention of writing that gave rise to and the kind of the early civilization cities. And what they're saying is that actually in the 2020s, all 5 of the foundational sectors of the economy are going to transform in unimaginable ways. So they are information, and we're already in the information revolution, where we've gone from a centralized broadcast model of media to a decentralized peer-to-peer system where everyone is a journalist. In food, you have the rise of precision fermentation, where we'll be able to create food from particles in labs at very low cost. They predict the collapse of the agricultural industry, the beef industry, in 2029. In transport, you have, you know, a combination of artificial intelligence with self-driving cars, where they predict the collapse of the automobile industry in 2028. And where you're going to move from everyone owning a car to transport as a service. And in general, materials moving from, you know, breaking down building blocks into smaller bits, processing them and sending them to the other side of the world, to actually building up from smaller elements and particles. And so they describe this shift as a move from a centralized extractive economy to a decentralized creative economy. And it has the potential to radically emancipate humanity in the next 10 to 15 years. But because of the significance of the disruption, it could easily converge in a collapse. And when I read this, it really kind of highlighted for me about the dilemma of activism in an extractive system, where any of the sensible measures that we take, for example, curbing growth, does come with a trade-off in terms of the prosperity that it brings us now. And that's because at a fundamental level, across all the foundational sectors of the economy, we have a basic model where we are breaking down larger building blocks and through economies of scale, you know, processing them and sending them around the world, which gives an inevitable rise to very big players that defend their interests. Whereas what we're seeing is a convergence of technology that actually gives rise to essentially the transition town dream of local, resilient, self-sufficient communities that can use solar to power their own energy, that can make their own food through precision fermentation, that can, no longer have to rely on industrial transport, and that generally can make anything they want from very basic elemental building blocks. And for me, this actually is one of the first times that I've seen, okay, there's actually a very positive system that's coming into view, and we can basically create the conditions, the infrastructure for that system, while also hospicing the old system. And that it totally changes the narrative that currently we have in Extinction Rebellion, which is, don't you see we're running off a cliff, but we need to stop now, why isn't anyone listening to us? To actually, technology is going to inevitably drive a shift from a centralized extractive society to a decentralized creative, and we're going to be the movement that ushers it out. And that's not to say we can prevent all the worst climate disasters from happening, because there's already lots of carbon in society, but it's a totally different energetic narrative. So that's my best attempt to summarize a 70-page report. I've posted it in the chat. I would highly recommend that you read it. I think that actually what's really missing is a positive, uplifting vision of the future that's grounded in really solid analysis. And I just don't think we can convince people to change with the "we're doomed." I think that the whole narrative behind the Beyond Politics Party is a joke. It's so negative, and it's so, just wake up, guys. It's a disaster, and it's hoping that people will see that the end of the world is coming and become prophetic activists. I don't think so. I think that they'll just put their heads down and just try and look after themselves and try and protect themselves. And so we're, Build Back Better is approaching something like a positive narrative, but still in it is a lack of confidence about what we could create or what's inevitable in a new system. And actually, it's not just, if we try really hard, we can bring it about. It's literally inevitable. The cost curves on about 15 different key technologies are coming together in the 2020s to destroy all of the main incumbent industries. We don't need, an animal rights movement to stop the end of meat eating. Precision fermentation is going to do it for us. We don't need to campaign against the oil industry. They're going to go bankrupt because of the cost curve dramatically decreasing in solar. And so what I see is I suppose, and I'm aware that this can very easily fall into techno-optimism, and I've always been very skeptical of that kind of messianic stuff coming from Silicon Valley. But I do think we're missing an actual understanding of how systems change, and how we actually marry politics and technological process in ways that actually deliver all the goals that we're searching for.
Yeah, well, tremendously interesting and mind expanding. I guess let me just, as you've given a strong case for that kind of radically positive way of seeing the coming disruptions, and if it were true, then it would certainly be something remarkable to, as you say, give a very different sort of basis for the attitude of XR as we go into the next few years. Let me suggest one or two reasons for a bit more skepticism. I was very struck reading the report that although they kept mentioning the danger of collapse, there was absolutely nothing in the report about preparing for the potentiality of collapse. And for me, that's the significance of deep adaptation. Not to think of it as a kind of form of doomism, which is absolutely disastrous, as you say, Ronan, but to say we're no longer in a situation where we can guarantee that we won't collapse. So the precautionary thing to do is, among other things, to prepare for potential collapse. And of course, another advantage of doing that is it really does make things very real for yourselves and for other people. If people can see that there is some endeavor going into preparing for collapse, then they can't pretend any longer that the worry about collapse is a completely theoretical one that they don't have to engage in. Another thing that worried me about the report was that there was no acknowledgement of the enormous ecological impacts of the information industry itself, which is what the whole thing is centered in. the way in which the technology companies depend upon this enormous material hungry and energy hungry infrastructure of big industry, and presumably on their imagined future that would have to grow enormously itself, and it's really pretty unclear to me how that is supposed to be compatible with their ideas of all the impacts are going to drastically reduce, etc. So it did seem to me as though there is a serious risk of techno-utopianism in the approach. Now, I suspect we shouldn't go into it in much more detail than that, Ronan, because
Yeah.
most people here won't have encountered it.
Yeah.
But it's what is definitely interesting about the debate is the way in which, as Ronan says, if you start to think that something like that could be a possibility, then it certainly casts a very different light on XR's efforts to disrupt, because a fundamental point you're making, Ronan, right, is that vast disruption is coming anyway. And the real question is who gets to be in a position to potentially nudge that in the right direction and take advantage of it in terms of an imaginary and social organization and so forth. Yeah. And that is one way in which your suggestion that at any rate XR should try to ensure that it's sort of, whatever happens, even if things go quite badly for XR in the next several months, that it remains sort of available in the way that BLM remained available to achieve this incredible renaissance in 2020. That seems to make quite good sense given that kind of potential context of vast disruption that is coming anyway.
Yeah, I mean, again, tell me to turn off my video. It's kind of, it seems to be pretty good at the moment. We just don't know. Like, for example, you know, Extinction Rebellion in its genesis has been very big in the UK. It could be that Australia goes through a dark night of the soul and Extinction Rebellion in Australia really takes off and becomes even bigger than anything we could imagine in the UK, or, you know, insert your particular country. So I do think it would just be prudent to think about, you know, what does strategic planning look like that allows us to keep enough infrastructure to be responsive in those moments, even if we're not hugely active as a movement. And that means making strategic decisions about, do we pile a load of money into doing a September rebellion in the UK during an internal financial crisis against that potential? So it's a more holistic, far-sighted view of Extinction Rebellion. I think in a general makes movements win is obviously, you know, issues have their own timing, just like society on some level reaches an ability to actually be able to look at the issue in the face and contend with it. But it's carried by an almost irresistible excitement and momentum. And I think we all felt that at the beginning of Extinction Rebellion, particularly in April and even in October, this idea that representing it, there was this new type of human that was deeper and more loving and compassionate and radical and willing to kind of put their body on the line. That was infectious. And I feel like ultimately we, you know, on an individual level, we all lose our way. And often all it takes is a good conversation or a period of reflection to find our center again. And it's usually found by really anchoring in whatever we might call source energy, but being really deeply listening and being guided about, okay, like what is being asked of me now in this moment? And like what's next for me in terms of being in service? And also, where is my excitement and where is my optimism and my positivity? And when you marry those things together, whatever you do, people will gravitate towards that. And I think that what we're missing is what that looks like on an institutional, collective level. Because what I fear at the moment is that it's a lot of people who are battered and bruised from years of hard campaigning, who are probably sitting with a lot of difficult emotions around XOR being sidelined, about not having the power it once had. And from that place of scarcity, you can just make bad decisions. And it only takes 3 bad decisions before you actually just run out of steam and then the thing just can't get up and going again. And so one of the primary things that I think is needed are spaces for us to find that source of power. And all I can say is that for me, reading that report was a missing piece of the puzzle for me. because I was carrying this cynicism and despair about the world and where it's going. And having read that, I'm like, oh, hold on a second. There's actually a really incredible system coming into view if we can just coordinate behind it. And it's not a given, but there was something about it that felt hugely motivating to me and a necessary piece of the puzzle. And whatever that is for you is for you.
Well, what you say about where XR is at certainly resonates with me, Ronan. I guess, and in a moment, I'll open it up to the broader group here. So do be putting questions or whatever into the chat. I guess the difficulty for me in the suggested kind of, which is sort of, it seems to be implicit in what you say, that having the September Rebellion at all is a kind of risk now. I mean, I think it's probably too late to not have it now, unless the coronavirus situation gets a lot worse in the next few weeks, which may well happen. I guess the reason why I'm inclined to think that actually, although the prognosis for the September Rebellion is pretty grim, we should go ahead anyway. Is firstly that I think that, as well as the remarks that you correctly make about how people may be coming at this from a paradigm of scarcity and so on, there is also an enormous hunger to get back to some of that love and positivity and just the power of action, rather than everybody being isolated in their own homes and so forth. So I think that there is a kind of hunger to try something. And secondly, and much more importantly, there's the point that was implicit in the passage that I read from my book at the start of this meeting this afternoon. Namely, the coronavirus reset is an absolutely critical moment. We can't, I think, allow this moment to go unmarked by a very explicit effort at rebellion. And the reason is that these opportunities for reset do not happen very often. As you said earlier, Ronan, activist movements rarely get to change the world just by themselves. They need the right kind of context, and a context of potential massive change of direction is one of the most powerful possible contexts you can have. The last comparable opportunity we had for reset was arguably in 2008. That's over a decade ago. That was totally fluffed, the financial crisis opportunity. If we miss this opportunity, then it seems to me that it's pretty much game over. We have to make massive inroads in the next few years if we are to avoid climate breakdown. I mean, true, full-on climate breakdown. And so this is almost certainly the last opportunity for any reset, which is not going to involve massive breakdown and societal collapses. So it seems to me that despite the difficulties, we have to go ahead and throw the dice now in some way. Even though the prospects for success look incredibly slim. I think in some sense we have to take the risk.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously get that now is the moment to seize on this reconstruction and make sure that it's not kind of supporting incumbent industries. But there would be nothing worse than the next major rebellion in September to be a damn squib where no one really shows up, because again, that compounds the reputational distancing that is already taking place around XR. And so we're a herd species, and we look to others for social proof of a movement. The social proof of XR is in the numbers it can get on the ground. That's basically, is XR a happening thing that I should be involved in? Oh, there's loads of people there. Yes, it is. And so I think it's gambling with its reputation by doing something in September when there's a risk of a poor turnout.
Well, at that point, perhaps it's a good moment to let others in to discuss where we do go from here. I want to suggest that Janet Story, who's just said something very interesting in the chat, might want to jump in and say something. Janet, I think you're unmuted. Do you want to give us your thoughts on where we're at and where we should go?
Sure. Which thought
Well, I
was
was
it?
very struck by what you said here about maybe the reframing what we're going to try and do in September could actually be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, this is just an idea, okay, but I feel that if we call it a rebellion and it's a damp squib, I absolutely agree that it could be hugely damaging, because it's just another opportunity for, you know, the press and maybe other groups to say, you know, look at you now, you bastards, no one's interested. But if we did reframe it, and it's not purely just a rebranding or a renaming, it's actually to change the intent of what is going to happen in September, because I totally agree. My gut told me it shouldn't happen. But if something does happen, maybe what happens is that we're completely honest and say, you know, we are really worried. There is a need for adaptation, and the XR actually, we're going to be on the streets, but it's not going to be a rebellion. We're not even calling it rebellion. We've decided it's not a rebellion. It's we want to talk to everyone. We just want people to come and tell us what they want, but it's not a rebellion. And we publicly, we go with that and say, look, we're in crisis like everything else. How refreshing would that be? I mean, it's just an idea anyway.
Okay, thanks. Jules, you've also just put something quite interesting in the chat. Tell us something about that. It seems to me that part of what you were talking about there is very much barking up the same tree as with the transformative adaptation concept that I mentioned earlier, and that is discussed in the book. Do you want to kind of place what you want to say there in the context of this broader setting?
Yeah, sure. I'll address a few things. I mean, I think with any movement, you know, when you rally to a flag, you get 100,000 activists that are already doing this work. You know, we were all already there. I reckon I certainly was, and we came together under this broad church, and that's why we saw this steep rise. And so, as with any movement, now is the hard yards. It's difficult, and it's difficult when it's unpopular. It's difficult when it's you know, when we're not getting the headlines. So I think we've got to stick at it. And just in terms of strategy, yeah, I mean, I put a quote from the XR 2020 strategy. And our strategy is interesting because it can be interpreted in different ways. But in particular, this quote is, if governments won't listen, then we must take the care of the planet and each other into our own hands. And so, yes, it's very much in what I've just posted is very much about building community resilience in the face of crises. And use the plural because we've got COVID, we've possibly got other pandemics, we might have a COVID season, we've then got various crises that are coming together. But we've got lots of great work that's kind of not XR, it's tangential to XR, and this existential question of what XR is. But just to run through these, trust the people, an army of facilitators that have been trained to hold people's assemblies, to integrate true deliberative democracy into our participatory politics, into our processes. We've got climate emergency centres springing up around the country. There's a 30,000 square foot warehouse in Ilford with a really interesting model in terms of how you get access to empty buildings for meanwhile use, actually get some funding for it. Access to money and a People's Green New Deal is something I've been working on with non-public sector sources of finance. Loads of acronyms in that about how we actually raise money, but some very exciting movement on that in terms of how we deliver hundreds of millions, if not billions, to communities to actually decide how they plan to mitigate, and bringing together things like neighbourhood planning, local development plan, economic development plan with the climate plan. It's really important we plan. There's a procurement policy. Some people may be familiar with it via the Preston model, which is all about community wealth building. And that's based around anchor institutions like the hospital, the university, the schools, the fire brigade, the police, the local authority, etc. That's being used now to actually look at how we combine the climate emergency plan for those anchor institutions as well. And what's really important as we do look at post-COVID regeneration is that any infrastructure that's created is community owned and democratically controlled. So there's a big movement towards that. Lots of land and skills groups springing up in terms of food sovereignty and regenerative agriculture. And so in terms of XR, I mean, XR, when I say some of this is tangential to XR, you know, I've often asked what XR is, and it's a broad church and lots of people do different things. But what we've been very good at is civil disobedience. We're the tip of the spear. We recognize that we're good at getting it into the news. We're good at causing controversy, and, you know, so we create the space. You know, we're the tip of that spear, and we move the Overton window and we create the space. So what follows behind in that vacuum is really important. And I mentioned in their relationships and movement building. So, you know, Friends of the Earth, RSPB, National Trust, Wildlife Trust, potentially moving behind us as well. So as we focus on this, I think that XR needs to, it's got a space, and this is a sort of strategy that can help build some resilience into our communities.
Yeah, thanks, Jules. That's really useful and encouraging. I presume it would be fair to say that if there are particular versions of those instances of those projects that people on this call want to get involved with or find out more about, they could direct message you or something like that?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Great, excellent. I'm going to bring in Adam Woodhall next. Just before I do, just a very interesting comment in the chat also from Matt in Cornwall, who says, look, isn't this the time to decentralize the rebellion, and won't that solve some of these problems? Well, maybe, and I think there certainly is a massive case for a massive decentralization in society, and that's part of what the transformative adaptation agenda is all about. But there is a problem lurking there for XR, which is that it's the decentralization, the decentralized structure of XR, which made it possible for Canning Town to happen at all, and made it possible for the minor disaster in comparison, but still pretty bad, of what happened on the Trinity College lawn in Cambridge to happen at all. If we thoroughly decentralize, then we make it impossible for ourselves to have any control over our own narrative. And that, as we've said, seems to have been pretty disastrous at some key moments over the last year. So I sort of bounce that back to you as a sort of, as a problem as well as a solution. Adam, you're somebody who, like Ronan and myself, has tried to think carefully for a long time about the strategy of XR and of these kinds of dilemmas. And you were involved for a long time in XR, including in the putting together of the April Rebellion. What's your take on the things that we're discussing here this afternoon? Oh, you're struggling to speak. What happened there? You were unmuted a minute ago. Yes.
There we go. Right. Great. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, you're a bit muffled, so try and enunciate clearly.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, that's better.
Great. Sorry. So thank you, and thank you, Rupert, for organising it, and for Ronan for those kind of like trenchant comments. And I have been interested in it because one of the things for me, as we've been talking about, April had an amazing strategy, and that also, underneath that strategy, was some great tactics, which included things such as, you know, pink votes, which represented the creativity, and the kind of grannies getting arrested on Parliament Square, which represented the non-violence and the civic disobedience. And that led to kind of like that really visceral feeling that people got. And then what was behind that was a good enough culture which kind of held it all together. But something that then became a real problem is that post-April Rebellion is that, for various reasons, which some people on this call might be aware of, the culture at the center of Extinction Rebellion collapsed into kind of like basically an internecine warfare over the Heathrow drones, which went droning on for about 2 or 3 months. And then basically we've never recovered from that. And there's various reasons for that. And, you know, I'm actually planning to do a podcast, which is going to go into kind of like more details on that. But the key thing is actually, even though the culture was good enough for just one short period of maybe a few months in the build-up and then running through the April Rebellion, culture is way more important than strategy, and strategy is way more important than any individual tactics. So the September, whatever we do in September, whatever's done in September, that is actually a tactic. It's not strategy. It's like, what are we trying to represent through what we're doing in September? That's the strategy. But then something that's really important is to recognize that the culture has become very problematic within XR, which is part of the reason why I personally decided to step out. And I've kind of continued doing sort of climate activist type sort of work, but it's I couldn't see how because once a culture starts going a certain way, and once particularly the leaders of the organization are attached to the culture going in that particular way, then it's very problematic. And I think, you know, he's been mentioned a few times. Roger Hallam was a particular facet of those cultural issues, and Roger isn't the problem. The issue was that the culture enabled his personal behaviour to cause certain other sort of unintended consequences, such as all these kind of like, you know, people's kind of like jaw dropping when like they found out that he published the Holocaust comments, or that he'd been and then also he had a gang of people around him. So for me, what I think I'd like offer to people is, in addition to all the really great things that we've been talking about today, is to be really thinking about if we want Extinction Rebellion, and I definitely want Extinction Rebellion to continue to go, and I'm very interested in Ronan's statement about kind of like maybe kind of stepping back a little bit in the short term. But it's, if we're going to have any short, medium or long term opportunity, it's really thinking about how do we deal with the culture. And now actually that Roger has effectively kind of stepped aside-ish, that gives a space for then some reconstruction of the culture, because he was quite a strong, he's a very, very strong character, got lots of loyalty within the organization. And because his energy was naturally important for the disruptive nature of what we did in April, you know, go into the capital city and shut it down. That was, you know, very much inspired by Roger. But then he unfortunately didn't know quite where to stop, and that encouraged other people to not know quite where to stop, which is then when you get things like the Canning Town action, you get things like the Cambridge actions. And then there was lots of other actions which didn't happen, which were kind of people pleaded with people to stop. So it could have been a lot worse, basically. And so, yeah, culture, as a famous old saying says, eat strategy for breakfast. So I'll give you that to chew on.
Oh, that's really, really interesting. Thanks, Adam. Maybe others will like to respond to that point about culture. Keith, would you be interested in weighing into the conversation? You put something very interesting in the chat where you're trying to suggest that maybe there's a sort of golden mean where we somehow manage to be decentralized, but also have proper responses to things when they need them. You know, so that we don't get the kind of disasters that can come from complete decentralization. Do you want to make a remark on that, or what you think more generally of the discussion this afternoon, Keith, and then I'll come to Ronan.
Yeah, so I do think there is a big issue in XR in that, and I'm having this in other organisations I'm part of, where it's felt kind of like, well, we should be democratic, whatever that currently means, and then the members are trying to decide what to do. But actually XR and the other organisation I'm working with have very clear strategies. They're trying to do something very specific. So you have to be careful of just letting that drift. So anybody who's making decisions about this strategy needs to understand the whole strategy. And my issue at the moment is the fourth demand, which to me doesn't make sense in the context of the current three demands. So I think I'm looking that we basically, XR does need a clear structure. It needs to know exactly where it's going, what it's trying to do. But then, as you said, we need decentralization. People, I think the comment there is in the north, they're feeling disconnected. They need to be able to do their own things. So there should be, as there are, the set principles that you follow. the set demands that you're aiming for, and then you just do stuff in that aims towards it. And then all the stuff that Jules was just talking about, that also needs to be on the side. So basically you're also doing all these other things. They're not directly towards those goals, but they are also good things that XR should say, yes, that is cool. So I think there is a nice happy medium, but I don't think XR has that at the moment. And to be honest, it just seems that XR is just lost in, and I spend days and days on this during the week, large amounts of meetings within circles, people looking at their shoes, discussing minutiae when the planet is burning outside. And I think we just need to get some focus and structure. That's all I've got to say. Thanks, Rupert.
Thank you. Yeah. Judith, do you want to come in a moment? Ronan, what do you make of what we've heard in the last 10 or 15 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all very wise. Jules's comment really struck with me that, like, you know, talk is cheap, and it's very easy as someone who used to work in XR and had to step back to offer these things. But ultimately, you know, the people who are actually still committed and getting stuck in are the people who are living out this experience and have the best insights. And yeah, so I just want to kind of, again, caveat my contributions and give more airtime to people who are actually working on it right now and can tell us what it's like. The thing that's coming to me is
oh, we just lost you again, Ronan. You said the thing that is coming to me is
the potential strategic error of September and how to plan around that and potentially minimize that. And just like to
oh, you're breaking up again, Ronan.
In order to successfully move the dial on our commitments, and how can it work with forces that are beyond our control so we get out of this kind of heroic mind thing, which is the kind of the, you know, the goes hand in hand with burnout and overwhelm. And just, the question I would have is, even if Extinction Rebellion doesn't have the power or the ones it had, how can at least it find its flow, that actually it can operate from a place of ease and creativity? And I'd love to hear it from people who are very much in the organization about how they try and do that, just as individuals, how they come back to a sense of grounding, creativity and playfulness, trusting that that actually is probably the best energy that Extinction Rebellion needs right now.
Yeah, it would be very interesting if anyone on the call wants to respond to that invitation of Ronan's. Put your hand up or say something in the chat if you do. Let me say a quick word about heroism. It seems to me that this is an interesting and complex one. On the one hand, it seems to me absolutely clear that we do need heroism at this time. We need people willing to make all sorts of sacrifices and do extraordinary things. We don't need the traditional sort of individual hero necessarily. So we certainly don't need Messiah type figures or people who think that they are charismatic leaders who have destiny literally on their side. That's dangerous, delusional, egoic territory. So we need, it seems to me, a new kind of heroism, which is also a very old kind of heroism, which is the heroism of collectives and of people within those collectives and co-creating those collectives who are willing to do the right thing no matter what the cost. And that sort of balanced view of heroism, it seems to me, is hard to find. It's the same kind of point with leadership, it seems to me, that there's been some very bad leadership in and around XR, and there has been leadership. You know, it's an illusion that there hasn't. There's also been some very good leadership, I think. And the distinction seems to be about whether the leadership is kind of open or not, and whether it's egoic or not. In other words, when people lead while pretending that there's no leadership and that it's a totally leaderless movement, that is disastrous because there's no accountability. And when people lead in a way such that they're in service to the broader movement and to the broader cause, well, then that's when the right kind of leadership is occurring. So it seems to me that we need to find some way of thinking about heroism and about leadership, which manages to achieve that kind of balance, and that we've done some of that in XR, but not done other parts of it, most definitely. Jules, you wanted to come back in on a bit of that.
Yeah, just to talk a little bit about what is going on, because I recognise that, you know, in a year of chaos and fast growth, things were imperfect and mistakes were made. And that's normal, I think, in any nascent or startup environment. I don't know if anyone here has seen the documentary about Greenpeace, How to Fix the World for Free or Change the World for Free. It's absolutely fascinating, and I'd recommend that because they went through many of the same growing pains. And this is the hard yards when you come down to when it's not fun, when it's bureaucratic, when the culture's poor, and these things have developed. How you change them? I mean, that is the difficult bit. I just started typing in the chat. So I'm part of the interim budget group looking at finance, and we've done some great work. I think that will solve many of our issues moving forward, putting in some really significant structure there. Governance and accountability. And there's even some proposals about how we have a sort of democratically elected executive, which allows us to make decisions quickly while being truly accountable. Culture and creativity, lots of co-creation and work on culture going on, and hopefully that will pay some dividends. And I'm seeing some really good moves towards devolution and decentralization. And you know, these topics of discussion are ongoing, and really great work being done about how we share information, how we share control, and how we share money. Emphasis on sharing. And in particular, you know, I mean, I've often been kind of in the center of the storm, this maelstrom, and have again suffered personally when things like Canning Town happen, and feel like good work's been undone and we've done 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or even 2 steps back. But what keeps me grounded is the local groups and the local work that I'm involved in. And for me, XR is as much about the network of connections and people, everyone on this call, our own personal agency and the ability to connect. Just by having this opportunity to talk about some of the mitigation initiatives, people have pinged me. I mean, that's the power of XR. So we're more than just this movement. We're also a group of people. So that's what keeps me grounded.
Ronan, do you want to come back on any of those things from the last few minutes there?
No, I'm just really happy to open it up and just hear
Yeah,
from voices.
yeah. I think we've got such a great quality of folk on the call here. It's really, really interesting to hear what people are saying. Who else would like to come in? Do stick your hand up, Leslie. I think you're on mute still.
Yes,
There you go.
Okay. I think that there's a dimension we're not discussing, which is that lots of people who are not heavily involved in XR, for instance, my son and so on, have a conception of capturing political power. And this has a long history, that a group, for instance, historically the Labour Party or an alliance, need to be in government because we can't survive without that central command. In other words, you know, you can have as many localized things and they're great, but you've got to have something to stop the centralized people closing you down, shutting you down, or making it irrelevant. Now that's a long, long history, and a lot of people are buying into that. And what this is about, in terms of what we're not discussing, are the people in the union movement. And we don't discuss that at all. We discuss our own ways of relating and so on. We hope to get there. And there's another aspect I really want to highlight, which is that having seen the Labour Party and its terrible sectarianism, which is the big issue from my point of view, which is why I left it, of course, I see XR in these kind of disputes. And what was happening throughout, from April onwards, was we had the young people who were saying, okay, we've only got so many years, we must take that action. And it doesn't matter how it affects people as long as it disrupts. And that argument, not just Heathrow, but Tubes and several attempts went on and on and on. And we see the same in the Labour Party, but we don't have an alternative, in a sense, to it. We can't abandon that traditional mode of attempting to take some form of executive power. That's my view, because it's in the heads of a lot of the people who are waiting, if you like, and talking to other people and taking limited action, but it's still a route that we need. And so what I say about the action in September, right, I'm going to go on the Black Lives Matter thing on the day before, on the 30th. We don't know how many alliances and other people will join us. And we don't know how our actions in the long run will affect that bigger political narrative I'm talking about. We can't predict it. And finally, I would like to say, yes, there is a need for leadership, a really good and responsive leadership of the sort that, because people, it's unfortunate, but people are motivated by a degree of real insight and clarity and direction. And if we're going to have a Green New Deal and a massive change, we bloody need that. I can't see it happening from loads of people who are well-meaning but arguing amongst each other, or they're doing local things which are brilliant. But we need that kind of centralized direction to grasp people's imagination.
Yeah, and I think it's important to be clear that there seems to be a lot of consensus on the call, which I'm glad about, that the April Rebellion was the most successful and important thing that we've ever done by some way. And it was, of course, overwhelmingly focused on London. That's a fact. That's not a coincidence. Matt, did you want to come in and give your two pence? You've made some interesting comments.
Yeah,
what do you think?
thanks. And firstly, thank you for the discussion. It's been one of the most helpful discussions I've listened to in months, actually, and really recognizing some of the dilemmas that we're all, my experience is that we're all carrying down here. I think the conversation has slightly conflated centrally led movements or leadership within the movement and gathering everyone into mass crowds in London. I possibly fed that confusion by talking about the problem of, by talking about decentralizing. I think there was a real damage to trust in October around Cannock Town that has really affected how many people are willing to come to London and sort of stick themselves on the line because they don't know what the movement's going to do next. But more significantly, last summer, we were organising talks here in Falmouth. We organised a talk here in Falmouth. We had 300 people came to it. We had regular weekly meetings with 40 to 50 to 60 people. We're only a town of 20,000. At the moment, we're doing Heading for Extinction talks every week online. We're getting maybe 1 or 2 people coming. There's lots of really committed rebels, multiple arrestees who are just saying, no, I'm not going to London this time. And I think we're missing an opportunity to connect with what Ronan raised, which is what I hear again and again and feel myself about being an XR is it's been a fantastic thing to be part of. It's been the sort of paradox of it in a way is that amid the kind of despair of what it addresses, many of us feel like we've had one of the most sort of powerful years of our lives being involved in it. It's been a really positive thing to be involved in. And I think that we could dig in at a local level and create gestures that were significant and not dispersed into lots of little myriad and different symbols, but doing something coordinated nationally. I mean, what if we shut down every single branch of Barclays Bank in the country for a day? What, you know, if we did things that began to connect with that power at a local level, because that people don't want to come to self-organized systems meetings. They really don't. But we organize an action and we've got 50, 60, 70 people immediately. So it's, I think local actions, when they're coordinated, could reconnect with the wild hope of April, which was this idea seeded that if enough of us go to London, if 2 people sit down every time they arrest someone, you know, we can act, we can find this we. I think we could reconnect with that we, with well-led, well-coordinated, but dispersed actions. That's it.
Very interesting. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks a lot for the call. I've got to split because my train's going. So
That's fine. Yeah, I have the sense that we're coming to an end here. Is there anyone else who would like to weigh in before we do wind up the call? Judith, by the way, has just written something very interesting in the chat. Anyone else want to speak? I'm not particularly seeing anyone, so unless I'm missing something, because I can't see all the screens all the time. Ronan, any last thoughts from you about what we've been discussing here this afternoon, about the topic in general, about the book? What do you make of it all?
Because can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Something struck me when Matt was speaking, that, you know, when the world becomes overwhelming and when XOR as an organization becomes unruly and the culture starts to break down and, you know, there's like a lack of direction, there is something about returning to the smallest common denominator, which is the local group. And I see that. And empowerment, if it's coordinating, having a kind of a renewal effect. And so I do think that there's a lot of value in that going forward.
Nice. Yeah. Adam, you've got a quick final thought.
Yeah, so I think there's just been an interesting chat and very good, respectful chat I hope we've had. And it's about Roger, really, is that I think I've been somebody, I'll admit this, who's culpable of kind of like putting all the problems at Roger's door, and it's not the case. But what it is like, in a sense, how do we go beyond this kind of narrative that we need a genius or we have a genius in Roger? Now, because there's certain things that happened which he did channel something very brilliant in 2018, which then led to the success. In part, it wasn't just Roger, let's remember, there was a big team around him who helped that happen. But it's like, just like he's set up beyond politics, how does XR go beyond Roger? Because it's not about Roger, it's not about any individual, it's about how as a community we can work together to stop this, what will be an inevitable extinction of our society. And it's not going to be about, as we've heard, one hero. And it's actually part of it. And I do it myself. I sometimes I say, oh, yeah, Roger's the kind of genius. But one of the things, if I could just suggest one thing, let's stop calling Roger a genius and just saying he's a very naughty boy sometimes and he has some good ideas at other times. And let's move on from it. So that will be my final point.
Very good. So look, folks, I'm going to draw towards a close here. Janet says in the chat, is there a chance or a system for feeding back to XRA, the rebellion? There is a feeling of sleepwalking into something. Well, one thing I'm going to try to do is to get the recording of this and the chat from this to the attention of a number of people in the movement, including the so-called rebellion weavers. And hopefully, therefore, they can be informed by what we've said this afternoon, because it does feel to me as though it's been really quite a successful event. As Adam said just now, we've had a really civil chat, but the substance has been strong as well, and a number of people have said things along those lines. So I'm delighted to have been involved, obviously, in setting it up and to have got it started with Ronan. Thanks to you all for taking part. Do look out, as I say, for the follow-up message that you should get at some point, directing you to the recording. Special thanks to Josie, my assistant, who helped set the event up. And of course to Ronan, my co-conversationalist. Absolutely brilliant stuff, Ronan. I will end by putting in the chat once again the link to my book, in case you want to go to that if you haven't already done so, for a bit more background on where I came into all this from this afternoon. And yeah, that's it. I'll leave the call on for a minute or two in case people want to touch base with each other. But we'll wind up here. Thank you very much for your time. And if I may say so, despite the various qualifications that have been made this afternoon, I do hope very much to see most of you in September to give it a go in the best way that we can, hopefully a little bit informed by what we've done here this afternoon. Thanks very much, everybody.